Hi, I'm Anastasia Chatzka, a fashion designer with over 20 years of experience and a sewing educator. And I'm really excited you're here to share another sewing adventure with me today. Welcome to Sew Anastasia, and today we are going to take in the sleeves on a sport coat. Having a perfectly tailored garment makes you feel so good. I recently had a client bring me a coat and they just needed the sleeves taken in a bit, so I'm going to show you how to take in the sleeves on a sport coat. If you're not already a subscriber to Sew Anastasia, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you know when all the new videos come out. And I'm also teaching virtual sewing lessons right now, so you can choose any project you'd like help on and register some time with me on my website, and I will help you with your project from my design studio to your sewing room. So cool! And if you're in Chicago, you can come into my design studio and take a one-on-one sewing lesson or a socially distant group class. Info for all of that is going to be in the description down below. Supplies for altering the sport coat are super simple. You're going to need some chalk, you're going to need a seam ripper, and you're going to need a pair of snips or scissors. The first thing you're going to need to do is pin it. So whether it's on yourself or on a client, try on the coat and pin it where you want it taken in. And make sure you're taking it in on a seam. So in this particular coat, I'm taking it in on the underarm seam because it was a bit big here. So notice how the actual seam is right here on the edge and I've pinned it. So this is going to be my new sewing line where the pins are. But now we've got to turn it inside out and mark it and chalk it. Next, take your sleeve and let's turn it inside out. When you turn it inside out, you're gonna notice an area on it where it's been sewn up before and it's gonna look like it's sewn by hand or maybe it's just sewn together. So you're gonna actually see the stitching on the outside. It doesn't look like a clean seam. So this is where they had put the jacket together. We're gonna go ahead and grab our seam ripper and we're gonna seam rip this open. So I'm gonna go ahead and open up this seam about 3 inches. If you want some tips on using a seam ripper, make sure you check out my seam ripper video. So you'll notice it's opening up. So I've got a little bit more to undo. And that's good. Next, we're gonna pull the self of the sleeve out of the opening. The self is another word for the outside fabric on the jacket. So you'll notice this can be a little difficult, looks a little awkward, don't worry. So you're also gonna notice these areas where the lining is tacked to the self fabric, the outside fabric, the blue fabric here. You can go ahead and cut that. And that's gonna release the lining from the self fabric. Okay, so this looks a little awkward, but this is my sleeve here, and this is the seam that I have pinned on the outside. Because if I pull this apart, you'll notice the pins right there. You can kind of see the pin here. Next, grab your chalk pen and let's mark where the pins are on the inside of this coat. So you want to find where the pins are and you want to mark on the right and the left side of where the pin is. Work your way down the sleeve, marking on the right and the left side of where the pins are. Now that we have all the spots marked where the pins were on the inside of the garment, what we want to do is turn the sleeve right side out and remove the pins. So there's the pins, and we can remove these because we've marked on the inside of the garment where they are. Now take the sleeve and turn it inside out again. Let's turn it inside out. Now we gotta find that hole again. So here's the hole. Let's go ahead and pull that out. Now you wanna find those chalk marks because this is going to be our new sewing line. So I see my chalk marks here and coming all the way down. The next step is to grab your pins again, and we're gonna go ahead and pin the fabric flat together so that way there's no bumps or tucks or gathers that are gonna happen in this stitch. So find your chalk marks on the sleeve, and I want you to take a pin, put it through where the chalk mark is and back up out of the fabric. So this is just gonna make it nice and flat when we're sewing because the seam is fairly bubbled because it's been pressed so well. So I really wanna flatten this out. You could also iron this flat, but I'm gonna go back and iron this after we sew it. Okay, so I have all of my chalk marks pinned, and now I wanna grab a ruler and connect the dots. So what we're gonna do is blend this first chalk mark into the seam here because we want a nice smooth transition from where we need to take it in back into the existing seam. So I'm gonna take my ruler and I'm gonna line it up with that chalk mark and I'm gonna blend it into the seam and go ahead and draw that on. And now what I'm gonna do is line up all of the existing chalk marks and connect the dots. So this way, I have a nice smooth line to follow while I'm sewing. And then same thing when you get to the other end here, you want to go ahead and blend this chalk mark into the seam. And you want it to be a really smooth, gradual transition. You don't want it to severely just like go off the fabric because you're gonna end up with this big bubble here if you do that. So really don't be afraid to go a couple inches up and just smoothly blend this line into the existing seam line. So you want this to be a nice, smooth transition into your existing seam. So you can see the line that I've drawn on the underarm of the sleeve. You just need to draw this on one side because we're sewing with right sides together. Don't worry about the underarm markings on the other side. We have it marked on this side, which is going to be just fine. Now let's head over to the sewing machine and sew it up. Today I'm going to be using the Husqvarna Viking Epic 95Q. And this is a brand new machine from Viking, so I'm so excited to be using it. But you can use any sewing machine that has a straight stitch. So go ahead, set up your machine for a straight stitch, and let's sew this chalk line. So you want to start your needle in the seam that's already there. And remember, we're going to follow that chalk line out. Don't forget to backstitch. And when you get to the pins, make sure you take them out. Keep adjusting your fabric. Make sure it's nice and smooth underneath. Nothing's getting caught. Then when we end, we're blending into the previous seam that's already there. Backstitch and cut. So you can see that we've stitched on that chalk line that we created and it's blending into the previous line of stitches. So take your seam ripper and I want you to rip out that previous line of stitches. This way, when we go and iron it, we're going to be ironing open our seam for the new seam that we have created. You're gonna do this all the way down both ends until you get to that previous line of stitches that we blended into. Okay, so you'll notice when I open that up, there's our new seam line. So you want to go ahead and iron this flat open, put it on a sleeve board if you have one. Okay, so you'll notice the seam is all bunchy and popping up. I want you to go ahead and flatten it so you can see our new seam and grab your iron and let's flatten this. This is going to give us a nice crisp seam on the outside. So you want to do this to the entire sleeve. So work your way down. If you don't have a sleeve board, you could also take a towel, roll it up, put it in the sleeve. Now that we have the seam ironed open nice and flat, let's go ahead and let's attach those little pieces that we clipped before that was holding the lining to the sleeve. So those are really important to keep the lining in place so it doesn't move around on you while you're wearing it. So I have that little lining tab pinned to the seam allowance that's inside the sleeve. So let's go ahead and sew that down. Make sure you're not actually sewing through the sleeve so that way it does not show on the outside. Make sure you back stitch at the beginning and the end. Now you can see the little tab of lining that's attaching the self seam allowance to the lining, and that's gonna hold it in place while you're wearing it. And you're gonna do that to every single tab that you have in your sleeve lining. So depending on the jacket that you're altering, it could be 1, it could be 2, it could be 10, who knows? 10 would be too many. So go ahead and do that to all the tabs that are on your lining. So next, we're gonna go ahead and sew up the sleeve lining because we don't wanna leave a hole in our lining. So we're gonna go ahead and put the self back inside of the sleeve lining. And now everything's enclosed in there. And last, we just have to sew up this hole that we have left, and then we're done. If you took in your sleeve more than a 1/2 inch, you're going to want to cut off some of that extra fabric so it's not bulky in your sleeve. But I didn't cut any off because I only took it in a 1/4 inch on each side, which is pretty small and it's not going to add any extra bulk to the sleeve. Also, if you took in your sleeve a bunch, you're also going to want to take in the lining of your coat. But I only took it in a 1/4, so I don't need to take in the lining of the sleeve either. So that's why I can just go ahead and sew back up the hole that's in the lining. I put in a few pins to hold it together, and let's go ahead and stitch where that original seam was. Make sure you back stitch. Take out your pins before you get to them. So we finished one sleeve and it's looking great, it's looking smooth. So you always want to turn your sleeve right side out and double check it as well. Make sure you don't have any bumps or puckers or anything. So this is looking nice and smooth. We've transitioned from our seam to taking it into our other seam. Now go ahead and do the exact same thing to the other arm so your arms are taken in the same amount on both sides, and then you're finished. Thanks so much for watching Sew Anastasia today. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And as always, make sure you follow me on Instagram at Sew Anastasia and Anastasia Chatzka. And don't forget, you can now take virtual sewing lessons with me, or you can come into the studio and take a class with me in person. I would love to see your sewing projects, so make sure you tag me in your sewing projects at Sew Anastasia, or DM me photos of your projects so I can share your creativity with everybody else. Thanks so much for watching. Bye!